The dust-stained letter trembled in Florence Thompson's hands as she stood on the platform of Fort Kearny, Nebraska, watching the train that had carried her westward disappear into the August heat of 1878. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston, armed with nothing but that faded letter, a leather satchel containing her few belongings, and an old daguerreotype of a woman she had never met but whose blood ran through her veins. The woman in the photograph, her grandmother Catherine, had allegedly settled somewhere in this vast territory before vanishing from family records entirely. Florence's father had forbidden any discussion of his mother, but when he passed 6 months ago, Florence found the letter hidden among his papers. A single correspondence from Catherine dated 1851, postmarked from somewhere near the Platte River. The platform was chaos. Soldiers from the nearby fort mingled with travelers, traders shouted their wares, and dust swirled in small tornadoes between the buildings. Florence adjusted her traveling dress, already beginning to wilt in the oppressive heat so different from the cool Atlantic breezes of home, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "You look lost, miss." The voice was deep, with a warmth that cut through the noise around her. Florence turned to find a man watching her with concerned hazel eyes. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives doing hard physical work, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that needed cutting. He wore dusty work clothes, a worn hat pushed back on his head, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this wild place. "I am a bit overwhelmed," she admitted, clutching her satchel closer. "I have just arrived. That much is obvious." His lips quirked into a gentle smile. "The Eastern clothes give it away. I am Mason Miller. I work at the Triple Creek Ranch just outside town. Can I help you find somewhere, Florence Thompson?" She extended her gloved hand, and he shook it with careful politeness. "I am looking for the land office, actually, or perhaps the Historical Society if there is such a thing here. Land office is 2 blocks north, next to the general store, but we do not have anything fancy like a historical society. What brings you out here looking for such places?" Florence hesitated. The entire venture sounded foolish when she tried to explain it aloud. "I am researching my family history. My grandmother lived somewhere in this area before I was born, and I am trying to trace what became of her." Mason's expression shifted to something more thoughtful. "That is a tall order in this country. People come and go, records are not always kept proper, and a lot can happen in 20-some years." "What was her name?" "Catherine Ashford Thompson. She came west with her husband Walter in 1850 or 1851. The letter I have suggests they were homesteading near the Platte River." "Thompson." Mason said the name slowly, as if testing it. "I have lived in this area my whole life and my father before me. The name sounds familiar, but I cannot place it exactly. Come on, let me walk you to the land office. Old Jeremiah Potts runs it, and if anyone knows about homesteaders from that era, it would be him." Florence fell into step beside Mason as he picked up her trunk with ease. The town of Fort Kearny was smaller than she had imagined, more a collection of rough buildings clustered around the military installation than a proper city. The streets were unpaved, and everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of the frontier life her grandmother must have known. "Have you come all the way from Boston alone?" Mason asked as they walked. "Yes. My mother thought I had lost my senses, but I am 23 years old and perfectly capable of traveling." "I did not mean to suggest otherwise." He glanced at her with what might have been admiration. "It takes courage to come this far on your own. Most Eastern ladies would not dream of it. Most Eastern ladies were not raised on stories of adventure, even if those stories were meant as warnings." Florence smiled slightly. My father used to speak of the West as a place of danger and lawlessness. I think he meant to frighten me, but instead he made me curious. The land office was a small wooden building that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind. Inside, an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a massive ledger. "Jeremiah, this is Miss Florence Thompson from Boston," Mason said. "She is looking for information about homesteaders named Thompson from around 1850 or 1851. Jeremiah stood, arthritis making the movement slow. "Thompson, you say? Catherine and Walter Thompson." Florence's heart leaped. "Yes, you remember them, remember them." Jeremiah's weathered face creased into deeper lines. "I knew them both. Tragic story that was. Walter died of cholera in the summer of 1852, not long after they proved up their claim. Catherine tried to work the land alone for a year or so, but it was too much for one woman. She sold the property and moved on. I heard she went to Denver City, but that was just rumor." The information hit Florence like a physical blow. Her grandfather dead of disease, her grandmother struggling alone and then disappearing again. "Do you know what happened to the land they claimed?" Jeremiah shuffled to a filing cabinet and began rifling through papers. "Should still have the records here somewhere. We keep everything, even old claims. Ah, here it is. Section 12, Township 9 North, Range 8 West. That would be about 15 miles northeast of here, up along Plum Creek. Who owns it now? Let me see." More paper shuffling. "Looks like it changed hands a few times. Currently owned by the Triple Creek Ranch. That would be the Miller's Spread." Florence turned to Mason in surprise. "Your ranch?" "My father bought up a lot of smaller claims over the years as people moved on or could not make it work," Mason explained. "I did not realize your grandmother's land was among them. If you want to see it, I would be happy to take you out there." "Really? You would do that, of course. It is your family history. Besides, I am curious now too. It is not every day someone travels 2,000 miles to find a piece of land." They arranged to meet the following morning after Florence had secured a room at the town's only boarding house. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed listening to unfamiliar sounds, Florence thought about her grandmother. What must it have been like for Catherine, arriving in this harsh place as a young bride, only to lose her husband and her dreams so quickly? What strength it must have taken to try to continue alone, and what pain to finally admit defeat and move on. Florence understood that pain. She had spent the last 3 years watching her father waste away from the same lung disease that had taken her mother. She had nursed him, managed their household, and slowly watched her own life narrow to the walls of their Boston townhouse. When he finally passed, she found herself at 23 with no close family, a small inheritance, and a desperate need to understand where she came from before she could figure out where she was going. The next morning dawned clear and already warm. Florence dressed in her most practical clothes, though even those felt absurdly formal for ranch country. Mason was waiting outside the boarding house with a wagon and 2 horses. "I thought you might be more comfortable in the wagon than on horseback," he said, helping her up onto the seat. "I can ride," Florence said. "My father insisted I learn, though I have not done it much in recent years." "Well, if you are going to be poking around this country, you will need to ride. Tell you what, on the way back you can try Daisy here. She is gentle as a lamb." They set out northeast, following a rough track that wound through grasslands that seemed to stretch forever. Florence had never seen so much open space, so much sky. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Tell me about your family," she said as they traveled. "How long have the Millers been in Nebraska?" "My grandparents came in 1847, before the big rush to California. My grandfather saw opportunity in providing supplies and stock to those passing through. My father was 10 years old when they arrived. He grew up in this country, met my mother at a church social in 1855, and they started the ranch together. It was hard going in the early years, but they built something that lasts. And you always knew you would take it over. Mason was quiet for a moment. I am the only child. My mother had difficulties with my birth, and there were no more babies after me. So yes, I always knew, but I also love this land. I cannot imagine living anywhere else or doing anything else. How old are you, if you do not mind me asking? 26. And you said you are 23. Yes. Quite on the shelf by Boston standards. Florence tried to make it sound like a joke, but there was truth in it. Most of her childhood friends were married with children. That is foolish talk. You are young, and you have the courage to chase your own path. That counts for more than marrying the first man who asks. They talked easily as the miles passed. Mason told her about ranching, about the challenges of drought and harsh winters, about the satisfaction of seeing calves born healthy and grass growing thick. Florence found herself telling him about Boston, about the suffocating social expectations, about how she had felt like she was slowly disappearing into the wallpaper of her own life. "That is why I had to come," she said. "I needed to know that I came from strong women, women who took chances and built lives in impossible places. I needed proof that I have that strength too." "You already proved that by getting on the train," Mason said softly. Around midday, they reached a spot where a creek wound through a shallow valley. The land was green here, sheltered by a few cottonwood trees. "This is it," Mason said, pulling the wagon to a stop. Section 12. Your grandparents' claim. Florence climbed down and stood looking around. Somewhere here, Catherine had lived and worked and grieved. The physical evidence was gone, any structures long since fallen to ruin or removed, but the land remained. There. Mason pointed to a spot near the creek where stones formed a rough foundation. That might have been the dugout or cabin. And see those trees? Cottonwoods that size could be 30 years old or more. She might have seen those as saplings. Florence walked to the foundation, her skirts brushing through the tall grass. She knelt and placed her hand on the sun-warmed stone, trying to feel some connection across the years. Had Catherine been happy here, even briefly? Had she stood by this creek and felt hopeful about the future? "I wish I could have known her," Florence said, not caring that tears were streaming down her face. "I wish I could ask her what gave her the strength to keep going after my grandfather died." Mason crouched beside her, not touching but close enough that she felt his presence like a comfort. Maybe she kept going because she had to. Sometimes that is all it takes. You wake up, you put one foot in front of the other, and eventually you find yourself somewhere new. Is that your philosophy? It got me through when my mother died 4 years ago. Some days it was all I had. Florence turned to look at him, seeing the echo of old grief in his eyes. "I am sorry. I have been so focused on my own losses. Grief is not a competition. Your losses matter just as much as mine." He offered her his hand and pulled her to her feet. "Come on, let me show you the rest of the property." They spent the afternoon exploring the section Catherine and Walter had claimed. Mason pointed out the best water sources, the areas that would have been suitable for crops, the natural shelter that would have been crucial during harsh weather. Florence found herself seeing the land through two sets of eyes, her grandmother's, viewing it as a home to be built, and her own, simply appreciating its stark beauty. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the grasslands gold, they sat by the creek to rest before the journey back. "What will you do now?" Mason asked. "Will you try to track Catherine to Denver?" "I do not know. Part of me wants to, but another part feels like I found what I came for. I know where she started, and I know she was strong enough to survive losing everything and start over. Maybe that is enough." You could stay for a while. Fort Kearny is not Boston, but it has its charms, and there is always work for someone willing to do it. The school teacher is leaving at the end of the month. I heard Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house mention she is looking for help. Or if you are interested in continuing your research, Jeremiah could probably use assistance organizing those land records. Florence looked at him in surprise. Are you suggesting I should stay? Mason met her gaze steadily. I am saying you have options. You came all this way to find your roots. Maybe you found something worth building on. The thought sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with family history and everything to do with the man sitting beside her. She had known him less than 2 days, but there was something between them, a connection she could not quite name but definitely felt. I will think about it, she said quietly. The ride back to Fort Kearny felt different, charged with possibility. Mason taught her the names of the plants they passed, pointed out where deer often grazed, showed her the distant outline of the fort against the darkening sky. Florence found herself memorizing every detail, as if her mind was already claiming this place as home. Over the next few weeks, Florence did stay. She told herself it was to do more research, and she did spend time helping Jeremiah organize the chaotic land office records. But in truth, she stayed because of Mason. He came to town twice a week for supplies, and he always made time to see her. They took more rides out to the old homestead, and Florence began to understand the rhythms of the land, the way the grass rippled like water in the wind, the enormous vault of stars visible at night, the sense of space that had initially frightened her but now felt liberating. Mason introduced her to his father, Michael Miller, a gruff man with kind eyes who clearly adored his son. Over dinner at the ranch house, Michael shared stories of the early days, including memories of Florence Thompson. She was a tiny thing, but fierce, Michael said. I was just a boy, maybe 12 or 13, but I remember her working that land like she was twice her size. After Walter died, some of the men in the area offered to help her, but she was proud. Took her a long time to accept that she could not do it all alone. You know why she left? Florence asked. Shame, mostly, I think. She felt like she had failed, like she was not strong enough. My mother tried to talk her into staying, told her she could find other ways to make a life here, but Catherine was determined to go. Said she needed a fresh start where no one knew her story. The irony was not lost on Florence. Catherine had run from her past, and now her granddaughter had traveled 2,000 miles to find it. As summer turned toward autumn, Florence found herself increasingly torn. Her money would not last forever, and she needed to make decisions about her future. She could return to Boston, sell her father's house and live quietly on the proceeds, or she could do something else entirely. The decision was made for her one evening in late September. She and Mason had ridden out to watch the sunset from a high point overlooking the Platte River. The air was cooling with the coming change of season, and the sky was ablaze with color. I have to tell you something, Mason said, his voice tight with tension. I have been trying to find the right words for weeks now, but I do not think there are right words for this. Florence's heart began to pound. What is it? I am in love with you. The words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back too long. I know it is fast. I know you have a whole life back east. I know I have no right to ask you to give that up. But I cannot let you leave without telling you how I feel. These last few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You see this place the way I do, you understand it. And when I imagine my future now, all I can see is you in it. Florence could barely breathe. Mason. You do not have to say anything. I just needed you to know. If you want to go back to Boston, I will understand. But if there is any part of you that wants to stay, that could see a life here with me, then I am asking you to consider it. Marry me, Florence. Help me build something new on the foundation your grandmother started." She should have been shocked. She should have told him it was too soon, too impractical, too many unknowns. But instead, she found herself laughing with pure joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Mason pulled her into his arms, and when he kissed her, Florence felt like every piece of her life suddenly made sense. This was why she had to come west. Not just to find Catherine's story, but to find her own. They were married in November in Fort Kearny's small church. Florence wore a dress she bought from the general store and altered herself, far simpler than anything she would have worn in Boston, but perfect for the occasion. Michael cried openly, happy to see his son so obviously in love. Jeremiah gave Florence away, and half the town turned up to celebrate. The ranch house became Florence's home, and she threw herself into learning this new life. Mason was endlessly patient, teaching her about cattle and horses, about reading weather and managing supplies. Florence, in turn, brought organization to the ranch's chaotic record-keeping and started a small library with books ordered from the East. But it was not all easy. The work was hard, the winters were brutal, and there were times Florence questioned whether she had made the right choice. During a particularly harsh blizzard in January, trapped in the house for days while the wind howled outside, she broke down crying. "I do not know if I am strong enough for this," she confessed to Mason as they huddled by the fire. "What if I am not cut out for this life?" "You are the strongest person I know," Mason said, holding her close. "You left everything familiar to find your past and ended up building a whole new future. That takes strength most people never find. What if I fail like Catherine did? You are not alone like she was. You have me. We are building this together." In the spring, Florence discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with terror. Childbirth on the frontier was dangerous, and the nearest doctor was 30 miles away. But Michael hired a woman from town, Mrs. Hanson, who had midwifed dozens of births, to stay at the ranch as Florence's time approached. On a warm day in October 1879, Florence gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Walter Michael Miller, honoring both Florence's grandfather and Mason's father. Holding her son, Florence thought about Catherine and all the dreams she must have had when she first came to this land. Dreams of family and future, dreams that were cut short by tragedy. "We are planting new roots," Florence whispered to the baby. "Growing a new family tree right here where your great-great-grandmother tried and could not. We are finishing what she started." Mason, watching his wife and child with wonder, felt his heart might burst. "He is perfect. You are perfect. We are lucky," Florence corrected. "Lucky to have found each other. Lucky to have this land. Lucky to have a chance at the life Catherine wanted but could not have." As Walter grew from infant to toddler, Florence continued her research into her family history, but it became less about finding answers and more about preserving stories. She started writing everything down, creating a record that Walter would someday share with his own children. She wrote about Catherine's courage, about her own journey west, about how love and land could intertwine to create something lasting. In 1881, Florence gave birth to a daughter, Margaret, named after Mason's mother. The little girl had her mother's dark curls and her father's hazel eyes. Walter, now 2, was fascinated by his baby sister and appointed himself her protector. Life settled into a rhythm shaped by seasons and the demands of ranch work. Florence became known in the community as someone who could help with reading and writing, and she began teaching children whose families lived too far from town for regular schooling. Mason expanded the ranch, buying more cattle and improving the land. Together, they transformed the Triple Creek into one of the most successful operations in the area. In 1883, a letter arrived from Denver. It was from a woman named Sarah Matthews, who had seen an inquiry Florence had placed in various newspapers years ago about Catherine Thompson. Sarah wrote that she had known Catherine in Denver City in the late 1850s. Florence's hands shook as she read Sarah's account. Catherine had indeed gone to Denver after leaving the homestead. She had worked as a seamstress and eventually married again, a kind man named Henry Ashford who ran a freight company. They had been happy together for several years before Catherine died in 1862 during a typhoid outbreak. She was only 42 years old. She had some happiness, Florence said to Mason that evening as they sat on their porch watching the children play. After all the hardship, she found love again and had a few good years. Like her granddaughter, Mason said, taking Florence's hand. You both started over and found happiness. The difference is I have you and the children. My happiness is still growing. In 1885, Michael passed away peacefully in his sleep. It was a crushing loss for Mason, but he took comfort in knowing his father had lived to see the ranch thriving and had spent his final years doting on his grandchildren. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the land he had spent his life building. Florence held Mason through his grief, just as he had held her through hers. It was one of the many ways they had grown together, learning to weather both joy and sorrow as a team. By 1888, Walter was 9 and Margaret was 7. The ranch was more prosperous than ever, and Mason and Florence had added to their family with another son, James, born in 1886. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Florence had finally convinced Mason to add a proper bathroom, though he grumbled about the expense. One summer day, Florence took the children to visit the old homestead site where Catherine and Walter had tried to build their life. The foundation stones were still there, now almost hidden by grass and wildflowers. Walter, whose namesake had died on this land, placed his hand on the stones just as his mother had done years ago. "This is where our family started," Florence told her children. "Your great-great-grandmother Catherine was very brave. She came all this way to build a new life, and even though it was hard and she faced terrible losses, she never gave up. That strength is in all of you." "Is it in you too, Mama?" Margaret asked. "I hope so. I try to honor her memory by being brave enough to build the life I want, even when it is not the life other people expect." They planted wildflower seeds around the old foundation, a living memorial to Catherine and Walter. Florence liked the idea of beauty growing from the ruins of old dreams, of life persisting and transforming. As the years passed, Florence and Mason's love deepened in the way of couples who had weathered hardship together and come out stronger. They still took rides together when they could steal the time, out to their favorite spots where the land rolled away to distant horizons. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in the kind of companionship that did not always need words. In 1890, Florence received a box from a lawyer in Denver. It contained items that had belonged to Catherine Ashford, who had died intestate but whose landlord had kept some of her possessions in case family ever came looking. There was not much, a few pieces of jewelry, a quilt, and a journal. The journal changed everything. Catherine had written regularly, chronicling her journey west, her early days with Walter, her grief after his death, and her decision to leave the homestead. But she had also written about her hopes for the future, her dreams of someday having a family that would thrive in this land she had grown to love, despite its harshness. "I may not succeed here," Catherine had written in 1853, "but I pray that someday my children or their children will find a way to claim this land and make it home. I hope they will remember that I tried, and that my trying counted for something." Florence wept reading those words, knowing that she had fulfilled Catherine's prayer without even realizing it. She had come seeking her grandmother's story and ended up completing it, creating the family and the lasting home Catherine had envisioned. She showed the journal to Mason that night. "We did it," she said. "We gave her what she wanted, a family rooted in this soil, growing and thriving." "You did that," Mason corrected gently. "You had the courage to come find her story and the strength to stay and build on it. I just got lucky enough to be part of it. We both got lucky." Florence kissed him softly. "I came looking for roots and found everything I never knew I needed." By 1892, Walter was 13 and already showing signs of becoming the kind of rancher his father was, thoughtful and hardworking. Margaret, 11, was clever and curious, always asking questions and reading everything she could get her hands on. James, at 6, was still finding his way, more interested in drawing and music than cattle, which worried Mason until Florence reminded him that the world needed artists too. That year, Florence was asked to write a history of the Fort Kearny area for a book being compiled about Nebraska settlements. She threw herself into the project, interviewing old-timers, digging through records, and weaving together the stories of all the people who had tried to make lives in this unforgiving but beautiful land. Catherine's story was central to the narrative, a reminder that not all pioneers succeeded in the way they originally intended, but their efforts still mattered. The book was published in 1893 to modest success. Florence was proudest of the dedication. For Catherine Ashford Thompson, who dreamed of roots, and for Mason Miller, who helped me plant them. In 1895, something happened that brought Florence's journey full circle. A young woman arrived in Fort Kearny from St. Louis, researching her family history. She was looking for information about a man named Henry Ashford, who had been married to a woman named Catherine. Florence invited the woman, Rachel Ashford Grant, to the ranch. Over tea, she learned that Rachel was Catherine's step-granddaughter, the daughter of Henry's son from his first marriage. Rachel had found references to Catherine in her grandfather's papers and wanted to know more about her. Florence shared everything: the letter that had brought her west, the land records, the journal, the stories Michael had told her. Rachel wept hearing about Catherine's first husband and her early struggles. "I always wondered why my grandfather spoke of her with such reverence," Rachel said. "He said she had survived things that would have broken most people. Now I understand." "She was remarkable," Florence agreed. "I never met her, but she changed my life. Looking for her brought me to this place and to my husband. In a way, she gave me everything I have." Before Rachel left, Florence took her to the old homestead site, now blooming with the wildflowers they had planted years ago. "This is where it all started," Florence said. "Where Catherine tried to build a home with Walter, where she learned she was stronger than she knew, where the roots of our family took hold, even though she could not stay to see them grow." Rachel knelt and placed her hand on the foundation stones, a gesture Florence recognized because she had done it herself so many years ago. "Thank you," Rachel said simply. "Thank you for remembering her, for honoring her, for finishing what she could not." After Rachel left, Florence reflected on the strange paths life took. Catherine had started over in Denver and found love again. Her step-grandson had a daughter who was now researching family history just as Florence had done. The connection stretched across time and distance, binding strangers into family through shared stories and shared blood. That evening, Florence and Mason sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done thousands of times over their 17 years of marriage. Walter was working with the horses, Margaret was reading, and James was playing some tune on the harmonica he had taught himself to play. "Do you ever regret it?" Mason asked. Leaving Boston, giving up the life you could have had there, Florence laughed. Not for a single moment. That life felt like wearing shoes that did not fit. This life, this place, you and the children, it all fits perfectly. Catherine left because she felt like she had failed, but she succeeded in ways she never knew. She succeeded in passing on her strength, her courage, her willingness to try even when success was not guaranteed. You have more than succeeded, Mason said. You built a family, helped grow a ranch, contributed to this community, and preserved stories that would have been lost. You turned research into roots. We turned research into roots, Florence corrected. I could not have done any of it without you. You offered to help me find my past, but you gave me a future instead. Mason pulled her close. I got the better end of that bargain. You brought life and love and purpose to this place in ways I never imagined. Every day with you is a gift. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Florence thought about all the sunsets Catherine must have watched from this same land. She liked to think her grandmother would be proud of what they had built, would be happy knowing that her dreams had not died, but had simply waited a generation to take root. In 1898, Walter married a local girl, Emma Patterson, whose family owned the boarding house where Florence had stayed when she first arrived in Fort Kearny. The wedding was a joyful celebration, and Florence cried watching her son exchange vows, remembering her own wedding day and the leap of faith she had taken. Emma moved into the ranch house, and Florence taught her the rhythms of ranch life just as Mason had taught her. The two women became close, and Florence found herself thinking about the community of women who had supported and sustained each other on the frontier. Catherine had tried to do it alone and eventually could not. Florence had accepted help and thrived. There was a lesson in that about the importance of connection, of letting people in, of building networks of support that could withstand the hardships of frontier life. In 1900, Emma gave birth to Florence and Mason's first grandchild, a daughter named Catherine. Holding the baby, Florence felt the weight of generations. This child was Catherine reborn, a new beginning built on old foundations. The family tree that Florence had come west to research had produced new branches, new growth, new life. She is perfect, Florence whispered, tears streaming down her face. Absolutely perfect. Walter beamed with pride. We wanted to honor your grandmother. Without her journey, none of this would exist. Mason, standing beside Florence, put his arm around her. Our family tree is growing strong. In 1902, Margaret announced she wanted to go to college. It was unusual for women, especially in rural areas, but Florence and Mason supported her decision. Margaret wanted to study history and education, to become a teacher who could help preserve the stories of pioneer women. You inspired me, Mama, Margaret said. Watching you research and write about Catherine and the other women who settled this area made me realize how many stories are being lost. I want to help save them. Florence helped her daughter prepare for college, sharing everything she had learned about research and writing. When Margaret left for Lincoln in the fall of 1903, Florence cried but was proud beyond measure. Her daughter was getting opportunities Catherine had never dreamed of, opportunities Florence herself had not had. Each generation built on the last, reaching higher. In 1905, James announced he wanted to leave the ranch and pursue his art. He had been accepted into an art school in Chicago. Mason struggled with this news, having hoped at least one son would stay and help run the ranch, but Florence reminded him that they had built this life so their children could have choices. We cannot clip their wings just because we are afraid to watch them fly, Florence said gently. James will find his own path, and it will be the right one for him. Mason eventually came around, and they sent James off with their blessing and enough money to get started. The ranch would go to Walter and Emma, and that was fine. The land would stay in the family, continue to grow and thrive. By 1907, Florence was 52 and Mason was 55. They had lived nearly 3 decades together, building a life that was richer than either had imagined possible. The ranch was prosperous. Their children were thriving in their own ways, and they had 5 grandchildren with more surely to come. One warm summer evening, Florence suggested they ride out to the old homestead site. They had not been there in several years, and she wanted to see it again. Mason saddled the horses, and they rode out as the sun began to set, just as they had done on their first ride together all those years ago. The wildflowers were thick around the old foundation, a riot of color in the prairie grass. Florence dismounted and walked among them, remembering the frightened young woman who had first stood on this spot, trying to feel connected to a grandmother she had never known. "I was so lost when I came here," she said to Mason. "I thought I was looking for Catherine, but I was really looking for myself. And did you find yourself? I found so much more. I found home, I found love, I found purpose, I found a life worth living." She turned to face him. "I found you," Mason took her hands. "I was lost too in my own way. Going through the motions of living but not really feeling alive. And then you stepped off that train, looking so determined and so scared, and something in me just knew. This woman is going to change everything." You changed everything. You brought joy and curiosity and passion into my life. You made this ranch a home instead of just a workplace. You gave me children and grandchildren and a future full of possibility. Everything good in my life stems from the day I offered to help you." They stood together as the sun set. 2 people who had found each other across the gulf of different worlds and built a bridge of love strong enough to last a lifetime. The land around them was the same land Catherine had walked, but it was transformed by their care and commitment into something thriving and permanent. "Thank you," Florence said softly. "For what?" "For helping me plant roots. For giving me a place to grow. For loving me enough to let me become who I was meant to be." "Right back at you," Mason said, pulling her close. In 1910, Margaret returned from college with a degree and a husband, a history professor named Thomas Green. They settled in town, and Margaret opened a school for girls, focusing on both traditional education and the history of women in the West. Florence was one of her most frequent guest speakers, sharing Catherine's story and her own with eager students. James had his first art exhibition in Chicago in 1912, and Florence and Mason traveled to see it. The paintings were beautiful, landscapes that captured the stark beauty of the Nebraska prairie. Several featured the old homestead site with its wildflowers and foundation stones. James had not forgotten his roots, even as he made his own way in the world. In 1915, Florence published a second book, a collection of stories from pioneer women in Nebraska. Catherine's story was the centerpiece, but it was joined by dozens of others, a chorus of female voices that had been largely absent from official histories. The book was widely read and helped spark a broader interest in preserving women's stories from the frontier period. Mason supported every one of Florence's endeavors, proud of her accomplishments and grateful that she had found ways to use her talents. He ran the ranch with Walter, teaching his son and grandsons the lessons his own father had taught him about stewardship of the land and responsibility to community. In 1918, the influenza pandemic reached even their remote corner of Nebraska. The family weathered it together, nursing each other through illness and grief when one of Walter and Emma's children, a boy of 12, died despite all their efforts. It was a crushing reminder that even in modern times, with all their prosperity and comfort, life on the frontier could be fragile. Florence held Emma as she wept for her lost son, remembering how Catherine had grieved for Walter, how grief was a constant companion to frontier women who loved hard and lost often. But she also knew that grief was the price of love, and that the love was worth the price. By 1920, Florence was 65 and Mason was 68. They had been married 39 years, had watched their children grow and have children of their own, had seen the ranch expand and thrive, had become pillars of their community. The automobile had arrived even in rural Nebraska, electricity was spreading, and the world was changing in ways they could hardly have imagined in their youth. But some things remained constant. The land still rolled away to distant horizons. The creek still wound through the valley where Catherine and Walter had tried to build their home. The stars still blazed in the night sky, and Florence and Mason still loved each other with the kind of deep, abiding love that was built on shared dreams and weathered storms. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1921, their entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Walter and Emma were there with their remaining children and grandchildren. Margaret and Thomas came from town with their family. James traveled from Chicago with his wife and young son. The house was full of noise and laughter and love. After dinner, Florence stood to make a toast. 40 years ago, I came to Nebraska looking for a woman I had never met. I thought I was researching my family tree, looking for roots in the past. But the most important root I found was standing right in front of me on a train platform in Fort Kearny. Mason offered to help me research my past, but what he really did was help me plant new roots, grow a new future. Everything you see here, all of you, exists because a cowboy was kind to a lost Eastern lady who did not know what she was really looking for. Mason stood and took her hand. And that lost Eastern lady taught this cowboy that the best things in life come when you are brave enough to start something new. Florence Thompson could not make her dream work, but her granddaughter came back and finished what she started. This family, this land, this life we have all built together is the fulfillment of her vision. We are her legacy, and Florence made sure we know it. They raised their glasses together, toasting Catherine and Walter, Michael and his wife Mary, all the pioneers who had tried and sometimes failed but whose efforts still mattered. They toasted the present and the future, the family that kept growing, the roots that kept spreading deeper. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Florence and Mason sat on their porch looking at the stars. It was a ritual they had maintained for 4 decades, this quiet time together at the end of the day. "You ever wonder what Catherine would think if she could see all this?" Mason asked. "I think she would be amazed and proud. She came here hoping to build a family and a legacy. She felt like she failed, but she did not. Everything she dreamed of came true, just not in her lifetime. You made it come true. We made it come true." Florence leaned against him. "I could not have done any of it alone, and I would not have wanted to. You are the best part of every day, Mason Miller. After 40 years, I still look forward to seeing you every morning." "Right back at you, Florence Miller." He kissed the top of her head. "When you get to be our age, you realize that the real measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but who you love and who loves you back. By that measure, we are the richest people I know." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, the same stars Catherine had watched over 70 years before. Time moved on, generations rose and fell, but the land endured and the love endured and the stories endured, passed down through families who took the time to remember. Florence thought about the journal entry where Catherine had expressed hope that her descendants would someday thrive on this land. She had done more than thrive. She had built something beautiful and lasting. She had honored Catherine's memory not just by researching and writing about her, but by living a life of courage and commitment that would have made her grandmother proud. In 1925, Florence and Mason celebrated 50 years since they had each come into the world. Mason's birthday was in March, Florence's in August, and they threw a joint party at the ranch. They were 70 and 73 respectively, still healthy and active, still deeply in love. Their grandchildren asked them to tell the story of how they met, and they did, embellishing it slightly for dramatic effect, but keeping the essential truth. Florence had come looking for her past and found her future. Mason had offered to help a stranger and found his soulmate. The lesson, Florence told the children, is that you never know when your life is going to change. I could have stayed in Boston and lived a safe, small life. Instead, I took a chance on a journey west, and it gave me everything. Do not be afraid to take chances. Do not be afraid to follow your curiosity. You never know where it might lead. And do not be afraid of hard work, Mason added. Nothing worth having comes easy. Your grandmother and I built this life day by day, season by season, year by year. We worked hard, we supported each other, and we never gave up even when things were difficult. That is the real secret to a good life. In 1928, Florence turned 73, the age Catherine had been when she died. It was a sobering milestone, a reminder of mortality and the passage of time. But Florence did not feel old, at least not in spirit. She was still writing, still researching, still riding out to the old homestead to tend the wildflowers. Mason, at 76, had slowed down but was still active in running the ranch with Walter. He had turned most of the day-to-day operations over to his son, but still made decisions about major investments and long-term planning. In the fall of 1929, just as the stock market crashed back east, Mason had a stroke. Florence sat by his bedside for 3 days, holding his hand and talking to him, reminding him of their life together, begging him not to leave her. On the 3rd day, he woke up, weak but alive. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," he said, his voice slurred but understandable. "You had better not," Florence said fiercely. "We have a deal, Mason Miller. We grow old together." He recovered slowly, learning to walk and talk normally again, though he was never quite the same. Florence became his caretaker, a role reversal neither had expected but both accepted. She helped him with exercises, read to him, made sure he took his medications. It was hard work, but she did it with love, just as he had supported her through everything over their 50 years together. By 1932, the Depression had reached even rural Nebraska. The ranch struggled as cattle prices plummeted and drought began to parch the land. But the family weathered it together, drawing on the reserves of strength and stubbornness that had carried pioneers through hard times for generations. Florence, at 77, still kept the household running, still wrote when she could find time, still visited the old homestead to remember where it all started. Mason, at 80, sat on the porch and watched the land, worried about the drought but confident that they would survive. "We have been through hard times before," he said to Florence one evening. "We will get through this too." "Of course we will," Florence agreed. "We are tougher than we look." In 1935, on a beautiful spring day when the wildflowers were blooming despite the drought, Mason and Florence took one last ride together to the old homestead. Mason was weak and the ride tired him, but he insisted on going. They sat by the foundation stones, holding hands, remembering everything they had built together. The land stretched away in all directions, scarred by drought but still beautiful, still home. "I love you," Mason said simply. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you on that platform, and I will love you forever." "I love you too," Florence said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for everything. Thank you for helping me plant roots. Thank you for growing this beautiful life with me." They rode back slowly as the sun set. That night, Mason went to sleep in their bed and did not wake up. He died peacefully, a man who had lived a full and meaningful life, surrounded by family and love. Florence grieved deeply but did not break. She had learned from Catherine that you could survive terrible losses and keep going. She had learned from Mason that love was worth the pain of loss. She mourned him properly, celebrated his life fully, and then set about the business of continuing. She lived 5 more years, watching her grandchildren grow, seeing her great-grandchildren born, writing down every story she could remember so that future generations would know where they came from. She made sure everyone knew about Catherine, about the strength and courage it took to be a pioneer woman, about the dreams that had brought her family to this land. In 1940, at the age of 85, Florence died peacefully in her sleep. She was buried next to Mason on the hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the land they had built together. Her gravestone read, Florence Thompson Miller, 1855–1940. She researched her roots and planted new ones. Walter and Emma continued to run the ranch. Margaret continued to teach and write about pioneer women. James became a renowned artist whose paintings of the Nebraska prairie hung in museums. The family tree that Florence had come to research continued to grow and branch, generation after generation thriving on the land Catherine had first claimed in 1851. Years later, a scholar researching pioneer women came across Florence's books and papers. She found the letter that had started everything, the journal Catherine had kept, the stories Florence had collected. She found photographs of Mason and Florence, young and old, always together. She found records of the ranch's growth, of children and grandchildren, of a family that had taken root and flourished. She also found one final letter, written by Florence shortly before her death. It was addressed to my descendants whenever you read this. The letter read, I came to Nebraska in 1878 looking for a woman I never met. I found so much more than I could have imagined. I found love with a good man who helped me become the person I was meant to be. I found purpose in preserving the stories of brave women who built this land. I found home in a place I had never been before. I found roots deeper than any family tree could map. My grandmother Catherine dreamed of building a family and a legacy on this land. She tried and felt she failed, but she did not fail. I came back and finished what she started, and now you carry that legacy forward. Remember where you came from. Honor the courage it took for Catherine to try, for me to come find her story, for all the pioneers who built this place. But do not be bound by the past. Use it as a foundation to build your own dreams, plant your own roots, grow your own future. That is what I did, and it gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. With all my love across the years, Florence Thompson Miller. The scholar included this letter in her book about pioneer women, and it touched thousands of readers. Florence's story and Catherine's story became part of the larger narrative of women in the American West. Women who had taken chances and worked hard and loved deeply, and built the foundations on which the future rested. And on the land where Catherine and Walter had first tried to build their home, where Florence and Mason had built their life together, the wildflowers still bloomed every spring, a living memorial to dreams that transformed across generations, to roots that grew deeper with time, to love that lasted beyond any single lifetime.